Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Passport to Wealth, the podcast that takes you on a journey through navigating your finances as a U.S. expat. I'm your host, Arielle Tucker, a certified financial planner and enrolled agent focusing on cross-border planning for U.S. expats. And I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Savannah Chafin, a CFP candidate, enrolled agent, and self-declared expat tax nerd, here to guide you through the maze of life and finances across borders and share the inspiring stories of fellow U.S. expats who have navigated the process.
Welcome back to Passport to Wealth. On today's episode, we're thrilled to welcome Emily Haines, an expert in U.S. taxation for expats and the founder of Expat Tax Solutions. With years of experience helping Americans navigate the complexities of cross-border tax compliance, Emily specializes in making tax planning more accessible and stress-free for expats, especially those living in Germany. As a certified public accountant, or CPA, Emily works closely with U.S. citizens living abroad to ensure they meet their tax obligations while optimizing their financial strategies. In today's episode, we'll be diving into Emily's story, how she ended up living in Germany and starting her company, the Expat Solutions. Emily, thank you so much for coming on our show today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I think we should really just title this episode From Scientist to CPA, because that's really kind of your journey. So I am really excited to dig into your journey. We've been friends for a couple of years, so I know a little bit about your journey, but I'm curious, what inspired you to leave the US and end up living abroad?
I first went to Berlin when I was 18. I was visiting a friend right after I graduated high school, and I think the moment I set foot in Berlin, I just felt like I was at home and spent about a month there. And the next, I had an opportunity to do study abroad when I was, I think, 19 in Berlin and spent 6 months and just never wanted to leave. It took me a couple of years, a couple of tries, I guess, to figure out how to live in Berlin and stay in Berlin. And so I had kind of a few starts and stops and finally managed to move there and stay for 10 years.
Wow. And so what was the job that finally got you your entry into being able to stay in Germany long term?
So I was trying to stay right out of college without any career experience, and that was really difficult. And I went back to the US to kind of reset right after college. And then I did my master's degree. I went to graduate school in London, and I went to London with the intention of it being kind of an in-between. Germany can be really hard culturally with the language. Berlin is particularly, the culture is takes some adjusting to. I was born and raised in North Carolina where people are polite, and getting used to Berliner Schnauze took some work. And so I went to London as I saw it as kind of a halfway point, I'll get a graduate degree and then either decide to go back to the US or go on to Germany after that. And then I got distracted by London and just never wanted to leave London. So I stayed there for 3 or 4 years, and then it was kind of time to move on to Germany.
So even while you were in London, you were still kind of dreaming and thinking about Germany for those 3 years.
When I first went to London, and then I'm a big city person, and I grew up in a small city. So I spent my teenage years in college years just desperate for big lights and the pulse of a big city. And so being in places like London and Berlin were amazing when I was in my 20s.
No, I think it's so interesting because you have experience in not just, I know that you've experienced in other countries too, right? You've lived in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and of course also you've lived now throughout the US as well. So you have all these different cultural points. And I'm really curious, did the years, the 3 years in London, did that help kind of build that bridge to Germany like you thought it would? Or was London much more like your experiences in the US? What was that like for you moving from?
It was a mix because people in the UK don't say what they mean. And I grew up in the South in the US where there's just a high priority put on politeness more than directness. I would say Germany is the opposite, especially Berlin is the opposite of that. And in London, it was a different flavor of that. And so I'm familiar with the concept, but it's also, I think in the UK, when Americans go to the UK, because the language is similar, you expect the culture to be similar. And it's sometimes even easier in Germany when the culture is so different and the language is so different. And so you come with an expectation that you're not going to really understand the context of what's happening. And in London, sometimes you can think that you understand the context, but you do not understand the context
Yes.
at all. And that, especially in a career, like when I was working for Deloitte, so I was in this very like structured corporate environment, and you just kind of get the sense of, I can't play the kind of networking diplomacy game the way that people who are native to this environment can. And so I started feeling like I wasn't going to it wasn't going to be an easy path, I guess, to move up and to establish friendships. And then the other thing I definitely felt in the UK versus Germany is when I was making friends with the locals. This is always difficult when you're an expat because I speak German, and I started learning German when I was in school, so when I was 12. And I had the
Wait,
great good
in North Carolina, they were teaching German at 12?
yeah.
That's
Yeah, all through
amazing.
high
Okay.
school, through college.
Was this a private school or was this a public school?
Um, it was a private school at 12, and then for high school, I was at a public school, and there was really good. I had the good fortune of having very good German teachers. And then when I did study abroad in Berlin, I did like I lived with someone in a home, and she was a teacher, and she enforced good grammar. At the time, she corrected every grammatical mistake I made and wouldn't let me speak English. And at the time, it was hard,
That
but
would be hard to live through, yes.
I learned so much so fast, and it's very hard to do that if you're not a teacher and you're just with your friends. I mean, my German friends are not correcting every grammatical mistake I make because it feels like it's interrupting the conversation, and it feels like a weird power thing happening. So if I ask them, they'll give me an answer, but they're not just randomly correcting all of my grammar. But that experience really upped my German for sure. And so my German is very good. And so I felt like I had a better in making friends with the German people because I could sort of demonstrate in this really clear way a kind of a commitment to integrate and an interest, and also, you have different conversations with people in their mother tongue than in not their mother tongue. And but I never had this in the UK because there's not this way to kind of demonstrate like, yeah, but I really want to be one of you. And also I think because the UK is like a smaller, like geographically smaller, people maintain their friendships from childhood a lot more easily than somewhere like the US where, if you move away, and we do move a lot in the US, and a lot of people in other countries they're just not moving across the country at quite the same rate that we do in the US. And so it's normal, I think, in the US to just have a whole new set of friends as an adult, and to have a lot of churn in the circle of friends. And in the UK, a lot of people were still friends with their school friends, which is great, but it's hard. It was very hard as a non-British person to ever really break into a lot of those friendship circles. And so it felt like a level of acquaintance, but it wasn't the same level of depth of friendship that I was able to get in Berlin. And living as an expat, you kind of have to make your family.
That's so true. Yeah. That's so true. So when you moved from London to Germany, did you move back to Berlin first or did you move?
Yeah.
Okay, you did.
I'm a
Okay.
Berlin person.
I know you are.
Not everyone. It's not for everyone,
No,
but
because well, as you know, Berlin is not my city. Berlin was
yeah.
not my city. So I love that you love Berlin so much because I'm like, I cannot relate to that
Yeah,
at
I
all.
can't imagine living in any city in Germany other than Berlin.
So when you moved back, like
Mhm.
professionally, did you find a huge difference in your work environment from going from London back to Berlin? Like, what was that like professionally for you?
So I did my master's degree in London in as a scientist in neurobiology, and then I worked in accounting. So I was working for Deloitte in an accounting environment. And then when I moved back to Berlin, it was to do my PhD. So I gave up. I gave up on accounting and went back to science. And so it was just a completely different shift because it was yeah, going from a corporate accounting firm to a lab. And then labs are always international, and so it's not really um, as kind of diluted culture. However, it was Charité, which just has some real East German cultural roots in it, in the bureaucracy around it. And so learning to navigate that was definitely an adventure.
Okay, so you come back to Germany to be a scientist, but
Yeah.
now I'm talking to you and you're back to being an accountant. So tell me about this like shift. Like at what point did you decide actually the whole science thing, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to move back into accounting. Like how did that transition happen?
Yeah, I bounced back and forth for a couple of years before finally accepting my fate.
As all good accountants do.
um, so I did my master's in neurobiology, which is I would describe it as my first love. So it's like yeah, like a teenage love affair that's full of passion, but maybe not very practical. And I wanted to stay in London when I finished my degree, but I needed to be sponsored for a work permit, and I did. London is an expensive city, and I was there as a student. So I did like excellent financial planning for my entire year in London. But what I failed to plan for was you do not get a paycheck on day one after
Mm.
your degree finishes. And I had not planned for that. And so I really needed a job and I needed to be sponsored for a work permit. And I did not have time to look around. And one of the issues with a career in science is because it's what you do is so specialized.
Mm.
Finding the right fit can be very time consuming, and there's just a lot of moving parts and a lot of things out of your control. So, what is your research interest? Who is working in that? Who has grant money available? Who is willing and able to sponsor you for a work permit? It becomes very complicated. And so I started just out of need, I started kind of making my career search like larger and larger and larger. And in London, one of my friends referred to said that banking and finance is kind of the coal mining of London. Like you may try to find another job, but there's just always a pull in that direction. And it's like, oh, fine, I'll just work in that. And so, but I was looking at kind of going into banking or going into accounting, and all of the accounting firms would do training programs for becoming an ACA, which is the British version of a CPA. So they'd hire anyone who seemed good, and they'd send you to school to take a lot of accounting exams. If you fail the exams, you lose your job, so it's
No
low
pressure.
risk for them. Yeah, my work permit was riding on that job too. So, and they would sponsor me for a work permit. And so I thought, well, I'll just do that for a bit, make some money, and then kind of see. And at the time, if you got sponsored for a work permit in the UK for 3 years, then you could access home student fees for university. So I was like, well, I could just, do something useful with my time, make some money. And then at the end, when I have this degree, I can go back and do my PhD
Mm.
um, as if I were a British person. And then about halfway through, they changed that rule and they made it not 3 years, but I think seven
Oh,
years.
wow. Okay.
And that's when I really started thinking like, okay, I, I was unsatisfied working in a corporate accounting environment. And so I started looking at other options and that just started growing in me. I was kind of locked in. I passed all my accounting exams and And then so you had to do 3 years of a work to get the ACA, and I was at 2.5 years. And then the financial crisis happened in
Mm.
2008, and they offered really generous voluntary redundancies. And I volunteered myself just very fast, and they
Yeah.
agreed. And so I gave up that job and took the cash, moved to Berlin to go back to being a scientist.
It's such a cool story, but I want to just marinate on the fact that in for both for London and for Germany, you moved as a student. Like that was the entryway in, and I think we see that a
Mhm.
lot with expats. Like getting like a student visa, that is often like the easiest. Like that's the lowest bar for people who are like just starting out, who don't have a lot of experience or don't have a specialized or high enough income job to get a specialized visa. Like that student entry is a really great place to go and live in a country for a couple of years. But the problem is depending on what you're studying, it can be really hard to get a job after you're done being a student. And every country has different considerations around how long can you stay in the country after you get your degree to actually look for a job. So like not all countries even allow you to stay to look for a job. They said, thanks for coming to get your degree. You may leave now. So you really have to kind of plan all that in advance if you're thinking about moving to a country to study. Just wanted to kind of highlight that.
Yeah, it's also a lot easier socially, I think, to move as a student. Once you're
Mm-hmm.
in a job, there's just other social dynamics that come into trying to make friends with your coworkers.
Yeah.
Whereas as a student, you're kind of built like usually you bond a lot with with the other people in your cohort. Yeah, in the UK, they had a graduate scheme at the time for science and engineering graduates. And we did a lot of research. I had a friend on my group. We were both Americans. We both wanted to stay. And so came across this graduate scheme, and you had to be in certain degree programs. And someone at our university had miscoded our program so that it didn't qualify. And I
Oh my
spent
gosh.
probably 8 months fighting with the administration to get them to reclassify our degree so it did qualify, and we succeeded. And I think we found out about that on like the day we defended our dissertations, that we were able to stay. But it wasn't. I've worked hard to live and stay abroad.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. We're just out of time for this episode. We're going to have you on, Emily, again for another episode where we're going to dig a little bit more into your actual real job now, talking about tax updates. But as a final question on this episode, I'm curious, what advice would you give to someone who's thinking about moving abroad? What would you tell them?
I think people really underestimate the cultural differences. And I think, especially going somewhere like Berlin, where there's a lot of bureaucracy, all developed kind of strategies for how you get through a system, how to navigate things that are in your way. And so in the US, usually you're escalating a situation like, can I talk to your manager? If you escalate and get like a little more aggressive, then sometimes that can grease the wheels in some ways. Sometimes you've got to pull it back, but we all kind of learn these strategies of like when to dial it up, when to dial it back. And those are completely different in other countries. And fighting the system in the way that you know how to fight the system does not, like, that's a losing battle.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yes.
have to adjust to the system. And the more angry you are that it's not logical, that's just wasted energy. And I think that I see a lot of expats moving to new countries and then just being frustrated that like this isn't the way that I thought it should be, and it could work a better way, but it doesn't. And yeah, a big part of success is just being like, okay, well, these are the rules and I'm going to follow them. And then not, you know, getting through the system and not with as much ease and grace as possible, instead of just being angry that it's a weird system.
Yeah. I think, I think about, because we moved abroad a couple of times now. And so I think back to like my first time moving abroad in my early 20s. and just kind of the anger that I had that the system just would not work in the way that I knew or thought it should work. And it's so true. It is such wasted energy to the point now where now if we ever move again, the last couple of moves, we have just hired relocation people to deal with the bureaucracy, because it's just, it will drive you crazy. It will drive you crazy. And at this point in my life with kids and my husband and I both working jobs, I'm like, I don't want to waste my energy on that anymore. But that's growth. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've taken, hand-stamped papers around Berlin to different offices at weird times, and that's just what you do.
That's like a whole nother episode, honestly. Yeah. Navigating German bureaucracy. That's a whole series that we could do. We're out of time for today. Emily, I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your experience with us. And we'll look forward to having you on our next episode, where we're going to talk a little bit more about tax filing updates. And we'll be sure to link both of these episodes as well as your contact details and website in our show notes. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes packed with insights and stories to empower your global financial journey. This is Passport to Wealth, where your financial future knows no borders.
The information provided in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It should not be considered professional, financial, or tax advice.
We strongly recommend consulting with a qualified financial advisor, tax professional, or other appropriate expert before making any financial decisions or taking action based on the content discussed in this episode.
Your personal financial situation is unique, and a professional can provide tailored advice to meet your specific needs.